Hey everybody, welcome back to History Student Reacts. Today we'll be watching Battle of Cannae, Chapter 2, Hannibal Part 12 by HistoryMarche. So, last time we saw the build-up to the Battle of Cannae, the most famous battle that Hannibal participated in. Now, I assume we will be beginning the battle itself. I'm very excited to jump into this one. If you guys end up enjoying this episode, I would appreciate it if you would check out my Patreon, which is linked down below, and will give you access to exclusive reaction content. Anyway, with all of that out of the way, let's jump right into this video.
Hey guys, the Battle of Cannae has 3 chapters. If you missed the previous one, you can find it here.
Yes, and that's what we watched last time. Today is number 2. And then next time will be Chapter 3, the end of the battle. Alright, July 20th, 216 BC. 50 kilometers north of Cannae.
Some distance north of Cannae, the massive Roman host lumbered forward through the plains of Apulia when the forward element spotted Hannibal hastily abandoning his camp just ahead. The enthusiastic Roman vanguard rushed forward. The pursuit lacked organization, but for once they caught the Carthaginian general off guard.
Alright, and that is a very rare thing. Now we have to see we're entering this Battle of Cannae. The Romans have mobilized this gigantic army. Can the Romans overcome their past defeats? Now, I'm sure most of us know how this battle's going to go, but this would be the question that the Romans would be asking themselves at this moment. You know, all of these battles they've gotten into with Hannibal, even if they outnumber him, Hannibal manages to draw them in, trick them in some way, and then defeat them. Can this time the Romans overcome that? Well, they haven't really changed their strategy much. They've kept doing the same thing. They had Fabius Maximus, who was trying something different. The Senate hated him. They basically fired him. So, they've gone back to the same strategy, which is raise more and more and more troops and try to overwhelm Hannibal. That's what they're trying to do. Let's see if it'll work this time.
They were not about to allow him time to consolidate. But while Hannibal's standard did leave the camp, the Carthaginian general was in fact lurking in the forest nearby.
Ooh.
He lured the Romans into an ambush yet again.
Okay, so supposedly they caught Hannibal unawares, but he's already pulled a little trick on them in sort of classic Hannibal style.
Despite their extensive scouting efforts, panic gripped the Romans, and it seemed like another disaster was afoot.
Uh-oh.
But Consul Varro quickly rallied the troops and reformed the lines, managing to beat back the Carthaginians. Hannibal committed significant forces in an effort to destroy the Roman vanguard and shatter the morale of the Republic's army in yet another ambush. But the legionaries he met on that rainy morning showed the kind of determination he hadn't faced before.
Alright, so this did sort of play out how all the previous battles have. Hannibal lures the Romans in with a little trick, then he manages to ambush them successfully, but this time the legionaries stood strong. They didn't buckle, and Hannibal maybe didn't win the sort of victory he was hoping for. Of course, as we know, we still have a lot to go, but at this starting point, I guess sort of a mixed bag for both Hannibal and the Romans. The Romans managed to get jumped again, but through seemingly in part the efforts of Varro, they managed to resist and keep going. Probably a good feeling for the Romans, given how many times they've just straight up lost to Hannibal. Being able to resist him at all, that's probably a morale booster, I would imagine.
And as a fan of our channel, you should definitely check out our friends over at CuriosityStream.
Yes.
My personal favorite streaming service that features thousands.
You guys
also
should check that out.
Supporting our channel.
Their video's linked down below. Use their link, give them a like, support them for making this fantastic content.
It's late July 216 BC. As the Roman column approached, word reached Paulus and Varro that the supply depot at Cannae fell into Carthaginian hands. The two consuls were alarmed by the news, knowing that Hannibal now had the resources to camp throughout the winter with little need to forage or pillage the surrounding area for supplies. This would keep the Carthaginians sheltered and rested, and would undoubtedly help Hannibal maintain high morale among the troops over the coming months. Meanwhile, Paulus and Varro were aware that, with their logistics disrupted, maintaining and supplying their vast army in the field would present numerous problems. From their perspective, a well-supplied Hannibal could now, in theory, try to play for time and prolong the war well into next year, which would give him plenty of opportunities to gain political points and successfully persuade Rome's allies in southern Italy to join him.
Absolutely, and we've talked about this a couple of times, but this is one of Hannibal's major goals, is to convince Roman allies in the Italian peninsula to leave Rome behind and join with him. He's been in Italy for, I believe at this point, roughly 2 years, so we're talking about a pretty substantial amount of time, but not too long. His presence hasn't been too established, but if he keeps going, you give him another year, you start to get to the point where Hannibal becomes a really established presence as he campaigns up and down the Italian peninsula, and some of these Roman allies might start to feel, well, Hannibal might be the more stable option. I mean, he has the momentum, he's winning all these battles, maybe we shouldn't leave Rome behind. And the longer Hannibal goes, the more he's able to gather that political clout. That's what he's already been trying to do, and that's what he continues to do. And the more time Hannibal can remain, especially if he's well supplied, the more support he can probably generate.
For the Roman leadership, the thought of a possible cascade of defections on their peninsula was unacceptable.
Right.
Hannibal.
Well, I mean, it's worst case scenario, right? I mean, Hannibal gathered some support up in the Po River Valley, aka Cisalpine Gaul, but to have him gathering support not only on the Italian peninsula, but so close to Rome itself, so close to the city, the center of the young republic, that's a big, big threat.
All had to be dealt with. However, while surveying the battlefield, disputes began over where to fight the planned battle. To the south lay Cannae on a line of hills, with undulated land beneath the hillsides, and a very flat plain north of the river Aufidius. In ancient times, the river itself is suspected to have had a different course, which ran further away from the hills, and the area surrounding it was mostly treeless, cultivated, open country, much like today. Paulus wasn't pleased with the ground, arguing that the flat terrain favored Hannibal's more numerous and better cavalry, expressing his preference to move the camp into the hills to the west, where the more broken ground would be more suited to infantry and would restrict cavalry maneuvers. Varro disagreed, correctly pointing out that the legions performed best on fairly open ground, expressing his willingness to give battle even in the open country north of the river.
Okay, so we've got some contrasting perspectives. Now, these could be worked out amiably, but this also touches on something we mentioned before in this series, which is some of the potential issues with a dual leadership or a dual executive system. Here we have Varro and Paulus. These are our two consuls. Now, there are certainly pros to that, but what it means is that if these two consuls have a disagreement, you might start getting into problem territory. If your two executives can't agree on how to get things done, then they're each going to try and drag the army or drag the government in one direction or the other. It can start to cause issues. Now, it hasn't gotten to that yet, but we'll see how they resolve this difference in opinion.
Despite Hannibal's superiority in cavalry, but arguing that deploying the army in the undulated terrain south of Aufidius would also suit the Roman infantry, whilst the river and the hills would restrict any extensive Carthaginian cavalry maneuvers on the flanks. Both consuls were clearly concerned about the mobility of Hannibal's cavalry. Varro was certain...
as they should be. As we've seen up until this point, I mean, Hannibal's entire army has been very formidable, but oftentimes his cavalry has outnumbered the Roman cavalry, and he has usually had better trained cavalry than the Romans have. I mean, when we're talking about this era of history, of course the Romans had this very impressive infantry, maybe weren't as known for their cavalry, whereas Hannibal had some pretty impressive cavalry as he was marching to Italy.
Certainly more eager to fight, and contemporary sources put this down to inexperience, whilst describing Paulus as the more level-headed of the two. But Paulus's plan was problematic in many ways.
Yeah, so, given how terribly this whole thing goes, there's a lot of finger-pointing and scapegoating afterwards. A lot of the blame for this battle has been placed on Varro. And once again, I mean, I'm not an expert on this conflict, so, y'all should read the history books, but I do understand that there is a bit of a debate over, well, exactly how much responsibility should he be assigned. We can look at the ancient sources, but the ancient sources do love to scapegoat and blame one particular person for big losses like this. So there's been some speculation from more modern historians that some of the blame placed at Varro's feet may be a little unfair or maybe a little over-exaggerated. And they're going into that a little bit here. So basically, as always, be skeptical when you look at these sources and understand that it's usually not as simple as it's described as.
The Roman host was very large and was composed of a mix between newly trained troops and more experienced legionaries, which made movements, maneuvers, and deployments of the army a slow process, which would have been even slower in the broken ground that Paulus suggested, despite other advantages such terrain would offer. In addition, it is doubtful that Hannibal would accept a battle against a numerically superior army in a well-defended position, unsuited for his cavalry. He would have likely arrayed...
And understandably so, we look at how badly Hannibal is outnumbered. I mean, he's been outnumbered before, but this is truly immense. Even under these conditions, he still has more cavalry than the Romans do. Shows you how important the cavalry were to Hannibal's cause, and sort of the relative importance cavalry held in the Carthaginian system versus in the Roman system.
His troops in the plain below to taunt and challenge the Romans, and if they didn't come down from the hillsides to fight, he would use this as propaganda to show off the Republic's weakness to its Italian allies.
Yeah. And that's exactly right. Of course, Hannibal is fighting this war, this conflict, but as we mentioned, it's also about marshaling new allies. So it's also about politics, And we know Hannibal is very good at reading the mind of his opponent. He is good at getting into that Roman psyche and working out what exactly they're thinking. He knows if he can effectively taunt them, that will probably make them look weak to their allies, and maybe that will cause some defections. But if he taunts them, and they take the bait, which I'm sure Hannibal knows is a very real possibility, because the Romans, the proud, fierce Romans, have almost always taken the bait, well, now he has them exactly where he wants them. So he's really getting into their head and thinking in terms of strategy, tactics, and frankly politics, what would be the best course of action.
Worse, Paulus's plan to move into the hills to the west meant that the Romans would perhaps be forced to wait until an opportunity for a battle arose, and that could have potentially kept the army in the field for a long time. Feeding and supplying so many troops for a prolonged period would have been a major problem, whilst Hannibal now held the most important supply depot in the area at Cannae, and could afford to wait. In addition, it is unlikely that Paulus completely refused the idea of giving battle on the flat terrain, because just like Varro, he understood that the Roman camp was already too close to Hannibal. Therefore, repositioning to the western hills would essentially require them to disengage. But any withdrawal from the field in the face of the enemy was very difficult and dangerous, especially for an army dominated by infantry that faced superior cavalry, who could...
Yeah, I mean, these are some very good points being made, and it's worth remembering, we keep talking about the size of this army, in many ways unprecedented. This is a massive amount of men for the Romans to marshal, and they are really not used to supplying armies this large, especially not on a regular basis. And so to marshal the supplies, the weapons, the food, all of that stuff for an army this big, to keep the army in the field for a long period of time, that'll be causing a lot of problems and a lot of strain on the Roman supply line. So this is what the Romans are having to keep in mind as they decide what to do.
Could pick them off piecemeal and potentially cause a rout. Furthermore, despite being an open country, retreating from an outnumbered enemy would be deeply dispiriting for the troops, especially given that the Senate, the army, and the people of Rome wanted to fight and destroy Hannibal.
Yeah, it's also just not the Roman way. Like I said, the Romans are a proud, fierce people. They want to keep charging forward. We've very much seen that when, Fabius Maximus was in control. The people of Rome, the Senate, some of his fellow generals, his subordinates, were very, very unhappy with his strategy of standing back, waging a war of attrition. Basically, everybody else wanted him to get in there and fight Hannibal. And so, along with all these other considerations, it really isn't the Roman way to retreat or move back or pull back. They want to fight. That's why they're here.
In every sense, the Roman army was now committed and could not easily pull away from the field without a battle. Therefore, whatever misgivings Paulus had, Varro's preference to fight as soon as possible was not at all unreasonable under the circumstances. The two consuls came from very different backgrounds. Paulus was the grandfather of Scipio Aemilianus, who was the principal financier of the famous Greek historian Polybius, the main contemporary source for the Second Punic War. Being paid by Paulus's immensely influential and wealthy family, it is easy to see why Polybius portrayed the consul in such a positive light, claiming that it was he who solely raised the morale of the army and made major efforts to organize the newly formed legions, whilst mentioning Varro only in passing as his colleague, not including him in his writings at all during the campaign until Hannibal was cited. And even then, Varro is portrayed as somewhat of an inexperienced hothead.
Yeah, so I'm going to say what I'm going to say. This is what I was talking about earlier, how we look at some of these ancient histories and they pin a lot of the blame on Varro. And you can see a part of that is the funding Polybius was receiving from Paulus and his family. A lot of these ancient histories are very skewed depending on who is writing them. Now you got to remember, these histories were written by the elite senatorial class, and these individual senators, these individual historians who were writing these things had a lot of biases based on who they were friends with, who their family was, who their patrons were, where their money was coming from, who was in charge at that time. They were not afraid to really make someone look good if it was in their interest and make someone look bad, or just omit them entirely if that was in their interest. Not to mention, to my understanding, Varro came from maybe a slightly less impressive background, and so there was also, that mark against him as well. And so he provided just an easy scapegoat. Now, like we're saying, we sort of have to negotiate between what do we know, can we trust these sources, what can we piece together, how much blame can we place on Varro? This isn't us saying, oh, well, the man deserves no blame, he didn't do anything wrong. No, it's just saying we should look at the situation fairly and try to use the evidence to come to a more even-keeled conclusion.
In contrast to the supposedly more sensible Paulus, this can make it difficult to separate propaganda from the truth.
Yeah.
However, it is true that Paulus had more military experience, having previously served as consul in 219 BC and was campaigning in Illyria.
Yeah, and this is exactly the point I'm making. It's challenging, but we gotta try and work out, okay, what exactly is true here? What is made up? What is propaganda? And, of course, it's really difficult to untangle these things, given the sources we have for a lot of ancient history, but it gets a little bit messy. We just have to sort of try our best.
But after being involved in a scandal with the distribution of war plunder, he was keen to avoid further stains on his reputation during his second consulship in 216 BC, which may have been part of the reason for his cautiousness prior to the battle. In military terms, the Illyrian War was a combined operation between the navy and the army, but there were no pitched battles. So despite the demands this campaign must have had on Paulus as a general, the conflict in Illyria did not require the skills needed for controlling a massive field army. And since his reputation was embellished in contemporary sources, we have no reliable way of knowing how good of a commander he was. In contrast, Varro was a novus homo, a new man, one of the very few in any generation of Roman political circles to be the first in their family to reach high office.
Yep, and this is what I was referencing when I said that Varro came from a comparatively more humble background. We've seen Paulus with his important family, his prior experience, even though we can't really tell how much that prior experience would have aided him. And now we look at Varro, a new man, first one in his family to reach such a position. When you look at the elite senatorial culture of Rome at this time, you can understand why Varro was maybe not the most popular individual. This was a very classist bunch. Like I said, that includes the guys who were writing the histories. So you can sort of understand why Varro makes for a good scapegoat on sort of multiple levels. Now, there might be some truth to it. There probably is some truth to it, but likely the amount of blame that has been assigned to Varro is over-exaggerated.
Contemporary sources further smear him by describing his ancestry as humble and poor, claiming that his father was a butcher and that Varro himself worked in the shop during his youth. Despite being described as a brutish simpleton, in reality, a new man needed substantial political ability to win elections against opponents from...
Yeah, this is a very good point, and this is where we need to look at the evidence we have and use our own brains to work it out. Varro is described as simple and brutish and common, but we might say, well, to even reach that position, he must have been a clever and skillful man. Now, that's not to make a moral judgment on the guy. He could have been good, bad, whoever knows, but he was probably clever and skilled, at least to some extent, to even be able to reach that position, and to, the senators, the elite class of the time, the patricians, him coming from these humble, what we might call sort of working class origins, that was not a good thing. To us, that doesn't make any difference, or at least to me. I see nothing wrong with that, but to them, oh no, that's another smear on his reputation.
Old prominent Roman families, and their many clients who voted for them. Varro could not parade the achievements and high status of his ancestors and had to find other ways of making his name known to the public in a voting system that heavily favored the rich, which in a way made him an underdog. This shows that Varro must have been a shrewd politician who managed to gain the support of influential aristocrats and senators, all of whom looked to invest in a candidate that would aggressively confront Hannibal.
Yeah, now obviously it's sort of difficult to pin down specific personality traits, but Varro must have had something to get him to that point, right? That much we know. And I like that they're presenting it like this. You might be saying, seems like they're giving us a lot of background on these two individuals, running a lot of defense for Varro. Like I said, yes, they are, but it's because of this historical narrative that has been established, but, has been challenged in modern historiography. So they're sort of presenting that challenge to the traditional idea of who's responsible, which I like.
A desire that was widespread in all political circles in Rome. In addition, changes to Roman laws in 217 BC made it nearly impossible for a consular candidate without military experience to be elected, regardless of the influence and prestige of his financiers. So while Varro never held senior command, considering the serious crisis that Rome was in at this stage of the war, it is reasonable to assume that he could not have been made consul without certain military qualifications.
Right.
On the second day came Varro's turn to command.
Though I will say, we talk about this new man, Varro. especially after this battle, but as the Second Punic War continues, we will see more and more new men, or more and more underdogs, rising to positions of power in Rome, because a lot of those guys who were at the top end up dying in a lot of these battles, in particular, this battle.
He led the army towards a position closer to the enemy, despite objections from his colleague. Hannibal responded by sending out groups of cavalry and light infantry.
Right, and this is where we get to that issue of dual leadership, where, once again, it's all very fuzzy, but maybe Paulus wanted to hold back a little bit. Varro said, no way, we're moving closer, and, it's my day to command, so I get to do that. We've seen similar things in the past with Fabius Maximus and Marcus Minucius, right? Fabius Maximus wanted to be a lot more cautious, Minucius didn't, and even though he saw success initially, he ended up sort of ruining it for the both of them. This can be the issue when you have this, system of two consuls, two executives.
To harass and slow down the advancing enemy column. Seeing the incoming Carthaginians, Varro closed ranks, and the column only barely continued to move forward. A series of skirmishes caused significant confusion in the Roman ranks, but Varro's formed close order infantry drove back each attack. The sporadic fighting went on until dark, without either side gaining an edge or inflicting losses on the enemy. But the Roman progress to a new campsite slowed down to a crawl because they were forced to maintain a constant fighting line, eventually encamping when night fell.
So, we basically remain at a stalemate, an even level, but if you're looking at this battle, you might be saying this is already not a great start for the Romans. I mean, they're moving to a more forward position, which, is that even advisable in the first place? Maybe not, there's pros and cons, so a decision that may be questionable, and in order to move forward to that new position, they had to fight through a bunch of skirmishes, and that movement forward was slowed down significantly. So, not the fastest or most impressive start from the Romans, but, of course, in the grand scheme, if you were looking at the battle, maybe from a Roman perspective at this point, you wouldn't necessarily think, oh, this whole thing is going to be a disaster. I feel like you would still believe that you could pick up the pieces and come out victorious.
Paulus, still supposedly reluctant to give battle in this terrain, took charge of the army next morning and continued the advance towards the site chosen for the main camp, marshalling the troops to close the distance with the Carthaginians. Meanwhile, Hannibal was still positioned on high ground near Cannae, south of the river, observing enemy movements without taking any action. The Romans proceeded to aggressively take control over the battlefield. 2/3 of the army remained in the main camp, while the remaining 1/3 of the troops was sent across the river Aufidius.
So I would say, in military affairs, we talk a lot about, seizing control of the battlefield or establishing the battlefield, basically having control over it. And that's a big advantage. If you choose the battlefield, if you control the battlefield, that gives you a big advantage when the battle begins. And that's what the Romans are trying to do here. But if you guys will notice, Hannibal is already there, and in some way he is allowing this to happen. Now, if this was another general, I might not assign too much importance to it. But this is Hannibal. If Hannibal's just sitting observing, I would be very, very worried. If he's allowing you to take this forward position, I would be very concerned that he has something up his sleeve, because this is what he's done countless times before. He, in one way or another, draws the Romans in, maybe by putting himself in a vulnerable position or sending some skirmishers forward. He draws the Romans into an aggressive stance where they think, we've got him now, we're taking control of the battlefield. Then he surprises them, ambushes them, and deals them a humiliating defeat. So I'd be very, very worried at this point if I was in that Roman camp.
Setting up a second camp showed the determination of the Roman leadership to put pressure on the movement of enemy troops, whilst taking up a position from where they could protect their own foraging parties that ventured close to Cannae. More importantly, this aggressive stance served to build up the confidence of the troops. Hannibal countered by a...
And, I mean, it's good for your troops to have high morale, but that Roman confidence has already gotten them into a lot of trouble.
Advancing down from the high ground towards a new camp location. Most likely the flat plateau atop a ridge west of the main Roman camp, leaving a garrison to guard the fortified depot at Cannae. The size of the Roman host was clearly on his mind as he continuously spoke to the men, encouraging them that this is why they came to Italy. Challenging the Romans for control over the battlefield showed Hannibal's belief in victory, which raised the spirits of the men. The new camp was in a fairly good defensive position, overlooking the plain below, with the river nearby offering the crucial water supply. On the last day of July, the Carthaginian general ordered the troops to prepare for battle.
All right.
The camp was abuzz for much of the late afternoon.
And, I mean, Hannibal's done a real good job keeping morale high in his camp. I mean, we've talked about how Hannibal plays these mind games with the Romans. He can really see into the Roman psyche. Clearly, he's just a good reader of people in general. He's a smart guy. He's a charismatic guy. He also knows how to keep the morale of his troops high. I mean, we saw last time, I think it was Gisco, or something like that, a Carthaginian officer who was worried about the size of the Roman army, and you can imagine that a lot of these Carthaginian soldiers were worried about this 80,000 strong Roman army, and Hannibal assuaged their fears, basically saying, look, they have a lot of men, but we've got the quality. They're men not nearly as skilled, disciplined as us. We've got them. And it seems like that really raised morale amongst his men. So, you know, I don't need to point out once again that Hannibal is a good leader in many ways, but we see more evidence of it.
As the men sharpened their blades, cleaned their weapons, armor and clothing, wanting to look their best and most intimidating once the battle commenced. Early on August the 1st, the Carthaginian army marched out of their camp. On the Roman side, Paulus was once again in command. He posted covering forces in front of the palisades of each camp, but the legions stayed close to the ramparts and little was done to provoke a battle. Hannibal, meanwhile, took the initiative and dispatched his Numidians across the river to attack the secondary Roman camp. He kept the rest of the troops arrayed for battle, facing the enemy camp for several hours.
Yeah, send those skilled Numidians in. They outclass the Roman cavalry, and then, if you can't get anything accomplished today, just wait until tomorrow, when Vara will be in charge. You know, if you don't want to deal, or one of these consuls won't engage in your games, well, just wait until the next one. That's one of the issues with this two-consul system, if they're not on the same page.
He exploited Paulus's reluctance to give battle to raise the confidence of his troops by impressing upon them that the Romans lacked the will to fight.
Yeah, and I mean, we can really see how whatever position you come at Hannibal from, whether it's aggression or maybe more cautious, he's good at taking advantage of that position. I would say, I mean, the best approach we've seen is from Fabius Maximus, who was cautious, but sort of did keep on Hannibal's trail. Paulus is being very cautious, he's clearly worried about engaging, and Hannibal's trying to take advantage of that. But we know if the Romans are more aggressive and they go straight in there, then Hannibal can easily take advantage of that as well.
Across the river, the Numidians were ordered not to press the camp directly, but to harass the foraging parties, mostly consisting of servants gathering water supplies, and chase them from the field. For Hannibal, this was another way to humiliate the Romans and show to his troops the inability of the enemy to counter the Numidian raid and protect their foragers. Some of the Roman officers felt ashamed with how the day went, resolutely wanting to turn things around, and the troops were especially displeased with the delay. Undoubtedly, the two consuls read the mood of the camp. And on August 2nd, Varro decided to fight.
Yes, he did. A decision that he will be much criticized for, well, honestly, from that point onwards. Even though you can see how he ended up at that decision, right? Okay. Chapter 2 of the Battle of Cannae series, three-parter, which is amongst the Hannibal series by HistoryMarche. Last episode was the Road to Cannae, sort of the build-up. This episode was honestly more build-up. You know, we're still sort of building up to that battle, but now we are, like, literally right there. And next episode, which is 22 minutes longer than most of their other episodes, we're going to get the battle itself. I'm very excited to get to the battle itself, see how it goes, see the aftermath. This is a very key moment in the Second Punic War, and a very famous moment in military history overall. So I'm excited to get to it. If you guys enjoyed this one, I would appreciate it if you would subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and check out the Patreon. Anyway, with all of that out of the way, I hope you guys are having a good day today, and I will see you all again next time. Goodbye.